The guilt came before the request, arrived before he even asked for anything. I'd feel it in my chest, in my stomach, in the way I'd start explaining myself before he'd said a word. He never needed to raise his voice because he'd trained me to hear disappointment in silence, trained me to feel responsible for emotions he never explicitly named, trained me to apologize for things that weren't wrong. By the time I understood what was happening, I'd spent 3 years saying I'm sorry for existing in ways that made him uncomfortable. By the time I could see it clearly, by the time I understood the mechanism, I had apologized thousands of times for things that weren't my fault, for having feelings, for having needs, for having a life that didn't center entirely on him. The guilt had become so automatic, I didn't even notice it anymore. Didn't notice I was constantly managing his emotions, constantly making myself smaller, constantly choosing his comfort over my own existence. It happened on a Wednesday evening. I was cooking dinner. He walked into the kitchen and just stood there. I asked if he was okay. He said fine, but the fine sounded wrong. Felt wrong. I immediately started reviewing my day, scanning for what I'd done wrong, what I'd forgotten, what I'd said that might have upset him, and that's when I understood I'd been trained to feel guilty for his mood, even when I hadn't done anything. Trained to take responsibility for his emotions, even when he hadn't asked me to. Trained to apologize for things that weren't wrong, just to make his silence stop. My name is Nicole. I'm 30 years old, and it took me 3 years to understand that guilt is a weapon, that someone can control you completely without ever raising their voice, without ever explicitly stating what you did wrong, just by making you feel responsible for their emotional state, just by teaching you that your existence causes them pain. You didn't miss the signs, you were trained to ignore them, guilty feeling by guilty feeling, taught to see your needs as selfish, your boundaries as cruel, your feelings as burdensome. The training started so early in the relationship you thought it was normal, thought it was what caring about someone meant, thought taking responsibility for their emotions was what love looked like. This isn't about obvious manipulation. Everyone recognizes someone who screams accusations, who explicitly blames you for everything, who lists your failures aggressively. This is about something far more effective. The person who never has to say you're wrong because they've trained you to feel wrong, who never has to ask you to change because you were already changing yourself constantly to prevent their discomfort, who controls you with silence, with sighs, with a certain look, with the emotional temperature of a room. If you've ever apologized for something you can't name, if you've ever said I'm sorry just to make the tension stop, if you found yourself explaining your choices defensively when no one asked for an explanation, comment the first time you felt guilty for something that wasn't. Wrong just 1 or 2 sentences, no need to explain the whole story. Because what I'm about to describe is how guilt becomes the primary method of control, how you learn to manage someone else's emotions by making yourself disappear. I met him at an early summer friend's outdoor party. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who observes before engaging. We talked for maybe an hour. That first night conversation was easy, comfortable. He listened well, asked good questions, seemed genuinely interested in what I thought, what I cared about. He asked for my number. I gave it. We made plans for coffee that weekend. The first few weeks felt healthy, balanced. He was attentive without being overwhelming, interested without being intense. We saw each other twice a week, texted regularly, but not constantly. It felt adult, mature, like we were both secure people building something real. I thought I'd finally found someone emotionally stable, someone who had their own life, someone who wouldn't need me to complete them. The first month he was supportive, encouraging. When I mentioned I was stressed about a work deadline, he said, "Take care of yourself. Don't worry about seeing me this week if you need space." When I said I had plans with friends, he said, "Have fun. Tell me about it later." He seemed secure, independent, healthy. Everyone I knew said he seemed really good, really different from guys I'd dated before, really stable. This is what I call the first bar, the moment that looked like emotional maturity, but was actually the setup for guilt training. He was establishing himself as the reasonable one, the understanding one, the low-maintenance partner, creating a baseline of his flexibility so that later, when he started needing more, I'd feel guilty for not reciprocating his earlier understanding. I'd feel like I owed him, like I should be as accommodating as he'd been. The shift was so gradual, I didn't notice it happening around week 6. After he'd established himself as the understanding partner, he started making small comments, subtle observations, not accusations, just noticing, "You've been really busy with work lately." "Yeah, it's a busy season. I understand. I just miss you, but it's fine. I know your job is important." The comment felt innocent, felt like someone expressing a feeling. I said, "I miss you too. We'll have more time soon." He said, "I know. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just wanted you to know, but I did feel bad, felt guilty for being busy." Felt like I was neglecting him, even though we'd seen each other 3 times that week. Felt like I should be making more time, should be prioritizing him more. That was the first guilt insertion, not an accusation, not a demand, just an observation that made me feel responsible for his loneliness. That made me feel like my work was causing him pain. That made me want to fix it, to do better, to be more available. He hadn't asked for anything, but I immediately started offering more time. Started canceling work dinners, started leaving the office earlier, started prioritizing seeing him over everything else. The second signal came around month 2. I mentioned I was going to visit my sister for the weekend. She lived 4 hours away. We hadn't seen each other in months. He said, "That sounds nice. I hope you have a good time." Seemed completely supportive, then added, "I'll just be here alone, missing you, but don't worry about me. I'll figure out something to do." It wasn't an objection, wasn't a request to cancel, just a statement of fact. But it landed like guilt, made me feel selfish for leaving him alone, made me picture him sad and lonely while I was having fun with my sister. Made me want to not go, or to cut the trip short, or to spend the whole weekend texting him so he wouldn't feel abandoned. I went on the trip, but I felt guilty the entire time, checked my phone constantly, texted him updates throughout the day, called him every night, spent more energy managing his loneliness than enjoying time with my sister. My sister noticed, said, "You seem distracted. Is everything okay with him?" I said, "Yeah, he's fine. I just miss him." But that wasn't true. I wasn't missing him. I was managing his emotions from 4 hours away. I was preventing his discomfort at the expense of my presence. The third signal happened around month 3. I'd made plans to take a weekend trip with friends, annual thing, planned months in advance. Girls' weekend, I told him about it, excited. He said, "That sounds fun, you should definitely go." But over the next few days, he kept mentioning it. "So you're leaving Friday?" "Yeah, so I won't see you for 3 days, technically 4 if you count Friday." "Yeah, I guess 4 days. That's the longest we've gone without seeing each other. I'll miss you." Each comment individually seemed fine, seemed like someone expressing normal feelings, but together they created a weight, a pressure, a sense that I was doing something wrong by going, that I was choosing my friends over him, that I was being selfish. The guilt built until I considered canceling, considered telling my friends I couldn't make it, considered sacrificing something I'd been looking forward to just to avoid the feeling of causing him pain. I didn't cancel, I went, but the trip was shadowed by guilt, by constant texting, by managing his mood from a distance, by feeling like I was being a bad girlfriend for having fun without him, by feeling like I owed him something for making him miss me, for choosing my friends over him, even though I hadn't actually chosen anyone over anyone. I just maintained a plan I'd made before I met him. This is the training phase, 3 moments where I learned to feel guilty for having a life, learned to see my independence as selfishness, learned to manage his emotions by controlling my own behavior, learned that preventing his discomfort was my responsibility, even when he never explicitly said it was. Part 7 is pinned in the comments. It explains how the good times were part of the trap, how the periods of happiness were strategic, how the cycle worked. You need to see how guilt connects to everything else. By month 4, the guilt was constant, automatic. I felt it before making any decision, before making any plan, before doing anything that didn't include him. The guilt came first before he even knew what I was considering. I'd internalized his emotional needs so completely that I was managing them preemptively, preventing his discomfort before he even felt it. I stopped making plans without checking with him first, not because he asked me to. He never asked. I just started doing it because it felt wrong not to, felt inconsiderate. It felt selfish to plan my time without considering his feelings. I'd text him, thinking about going to yoga Thursday after work. Is that okay? He'd say, of course, you don't have to ask permission, but if I didn't ask, I'd feel guilty the entire time I was gone. I stopped sharing good news immediately, started filtering what I told him based on how it might make him feel. Got a promotion at work, spent the first few minutes figuring out how to tell him in a way that wouldn't make him feel bad about his own job. Friend announced her engagement, spent time thinking about whether telling him would make him feel pressured about our relationship timeline. I was managing his potential emotional reactions before they even happened, making myself smaller to prevent discomfort he might not even feel. I started apologizing constantly, reflexively for things that weren't wrong, for being tired after work. Sorry, I'm not very talkative tonight. For having a headache. Sorry, I can't go out tonight. For being stressed about family stuff. Sorry, I'm distracted. For having feelings that weren't about him. Sorry, I'm upset about my friend's situation. I should focus on us. The apologies became automatic, became my default response to existing in any way that might require him to accommodate me. The guilt made me hypervigilant, constantly monitoring his mood, constantly scanning for signs of disappointment, constantly trying to prevent his discomfort. I'd walk into a room and immediately assess his emotional state, read his face, his posture, his tone, trying to determine if I'd done something wrong, trying to figure out what I needed to fix, trying to prevent problems before they became explicit. He never had to tell me I disappointed him. I could feel it, could see it in the way he went quiet, in the way he sighed, in the way his energy shifted. And I'd immediately start apologizing, immediately start explaining, immediately start trying to fix whatever I'd done, even when I didn't. Know what I'd done, even when I hadn't actually done anything wrong. By month 6, I was exhausted, completely depleted. The constant emotional management was draining. The constant guilt was suffocating. I couldn't make a decision without anxiety, couldn't have a feeling without apologizing for it, couldn't exist without wondering if I was causing him pain. But I didn't recognize it as abuse, thought it was just me being sensitive, being anxious, being too worried about his feelings. My friends started noticing, you apologize for everything now. Yeah, I've always been like that. No, you haven't. This is new. You seem anxious all the time. I'm fine, just stressed with work. One friend said directly, he makes you feel guilty for having a life. He's actually really understanding. Then why do you seem guilty all the time? I don't know. I just want to be a good girlfriend. I didn't know how to explain it because he wasn't doing anything I could point to. He wasn't yelling, wasn't making accusations, wasn't explicitly controlling me. He was just existing, just having feelings. Just being disappointed sometimes, just going quiet when I made choices he didn't like. How do you explain that someone's silence is controlling you? That someone's sighs are training you? That someone's mood is dictating your entire life? By month 8, I'd stopped doing most things that didn't involve him, stopped going to yoga, stopped seeing friends as often, stopped taking time for myself, not because he forbid it. He never forbid anything, but because the guilt of doing those things was worse than the loss of doing them. It was easier to just not go than to manage the guilt of going. Easier to center my life on him than to constantly feel selfish for having other priorities. The guilt had become the relationship. I couldn't separate caring about him from feeling guilty around him. Couldn't separate love from constant emotional management. Couldn't separate intimacy from making myself smaller and smaller until I barely existed. I thought that's what relationships required, thought that's what it meant to consider someone else's feelings, thought I was just being mature, being unselfish, being a good partner. By month 10, I'd started having physical symptoms, stomach problems, headaches, couldn't sleep well. Doctor said it was stress. Asked what was going on in my life. I said just normal stuff, work, relationship, everything's fine. Doctor suggested therapy for anxiety. I started going, spent the first 3 sessions talking about how anxious I was, how guilty I felt all the time, how I couldn't make decisions without stress. The therapist asked about my relationship. I said it was good. He's really understanding, really patient with me. She asked what I felt guilty about. I said everything, just existing, having needs, having feelings, taking up space. She asked if he makes me feel that way. I said no. He never says anything. I just feel it. She wrote something down. Asked me to start noticing when the guilt comes up, what triggers it, what happens right before. I started paying attention, started noticing patterns I'd been too close to see. The guilt came whenever I did anything for myself, whenever I had a need, whenever I had a feeling that wasn't about him, whenever I made a choice that prioritized my well-being over his comfort. The guilt came when he went quiet, when he sighed, when his mood shifted, when he said fine in a way that meant not fine. The guilt came before he said anything, before he asked for anything, before he did anything. I've been trained so thoroughly that I was controlling myself. I was the one making me smaller. I was the one apologizing constantly. I was the one managing his emotions. He taught me to do it to myself. That was the genius of it. He didn't have to control me because I was controlling myself on his behalf. It was a Wednesday evening in month 11. I was cooking dinner something. I'd made dozens of times. He walked into the kitchen and just stood there silent. I asked if he was okay. He said fine, but the fine felt heavy, felt loaded, felt like disappointment. I immediately started scanning. What did I do? What did I forget? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. Why do you always think something's wrong? This is what I call the log. The moment I finally understood, but it was too late to easily leave. I was standing at the stove stirring pasta. He was standing in the doorway silent, and I realized I was holding my breath. I was tense. I was anxious. I was reviewing my entire day, trying to figure out what I'd done to cause his mood. And I hadn't done anything, literally nothing. He'd just walked into the kitchen and stood there, and I'd immediately felt guilty. That's when I understood. The guilt wasn't about anything I'd done. The guilt was the control mechanism itself. I'd been trained to feel responsible for his emotional state, regardless of my actions. Trained to manage his moods. Trained to make his comfort my primary concern. Trained to feel guilty for existing in ways that required him to accommodate me. The guilt was automatic, reflexive, constant, and it had nothing to do with whether I'd actually done anything wrong. I stood there stirring pasta and started crying, quiet tears I tried to hide. He asked what was wrong. I said nothing. I'm fine. He said, you're clearly not fine. I said, I don't know. I just feel like I'm always doing something wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. Then why do I feel this way? I don't know. Maybe you should talk to your therapist about your anxiety. This isn't about my anxiety. This is about, I stopped, didn't know how to finish the sentence. I couldn't say this is about you making me feel guilty because he'd never explicitly made me feel anything. Couldn't say this is about you controlling me because he'd never explicitly controlled anything. Couldn't say this is about your silence being a weapon because silence isn't a weapon, it's just silence. How do you name something that's never said? How do you point to something that's always implied? How do you prove you're being controlled when the control is in what's not happening? Over the next few weeks, I started testing. It started noticing when I felt guilty, started trying to name what triggered it, made plans. With a friend felt guilty, he hadn't said anything, hadn't objected, hadn't even known. I'd made the plans, yet the guilt was preemptive, was based on anticipated disappointment, was based on patterns. I'd learned stayed late at work for a meeting, felt guilty, texted him. I'll be late, he said. Okay, no problem, but I still felt guilty, felt like I was neglecting him, felt like I should have left earlier. Went to the gym after work without telling him first. Felt guilty the entire workout, kept checking my phone, expecting where are you text. Expecting to have to explain, expecting to have to justify. The text never came, but the guilt was there anyway. The guilt was no longer about his reaction. The guilt was about my action. I'd internalized his expectations so completely that I was enforcing them on myself. The guilt was the trap, more effective than rules, more controlling than demands, because I was doing it to myself. I was managing my own behavior. I was limiting my own life. I was making myself smaller, all to prevent a discomfort that might not even happen, all to manage emotions he might not even have. I'd become my own jailer, my own monitor, my own restriction. My therapist had a term for it: coercive control through emotional manipulation. He trained me to feel responsible for his emotional state, to see my needs as burdensome, to see my existence as something to apologize for. The training had been so gradual, so subtle, that I thought it was normal, thought it was what consideration looked like, thought it was what mature relationships required. She explained that healthy relationships don't require constant emotional management, don't make you feel guilty for having needs, don't make you responsible for someone else's moods, that it's not normal to feel anxious before every decision, not normal to apologize for existing, not normal to constantly make yourself smaller to prevent someone else's discomfort, that I'd been systematically trained, and the training had worked perfectly. The difference between healthy consideration and guilt-based control is in reciprocity and expectation. Healthy consideration is mutual. Both people accommodate each other. Both people communicate needs directly. Both people take responsibility for their own emotions. Guilt-based control is one-directional. One person constantly accommodates. One person manages emotions for two. One person makes themselves smaller while the other person's needs expand to fill all available space. Healthy partners say, I'm disappointed, but I understand. I'm sad, but it's not your fault. I miss you, but have fun. Guilt-inducing partners say, I'm fine, but I'll be here alone. I understand, but I thought we were going to spend time together. It's okay. But this is the third time this week the words sound understanding, but the subtext is blame the tone as accommodation, but the effect is guilt. They never have to say you're wrong because they've trained you to feel wrong. This is the cost, what I lost that I can never fully recover. 3 years of making myself smaller. 3 years of managing someone else's emotions at the expense of my own. 3 years of feeling guilty for having needs, for having feelings, for having a life. 3 years of apologizing for existing in ways that required accommodation. I lost my sense of what normal relationships feel like. Lost my ability to have needs without guilt. Lost my confidence in my own judgment about what's reasonable to expect. Leaving took 4 months of planning, 4 months of rebuilding my tolerance for guilt, 4 months of practicing having needs without apologizing, 4 months of allowing myself to exist without managing his emotional response. The guilt didn't go away when I left. It followed me. I still feel it sometimes, still catch myself apologizing for things that aren't wrong. Still catch myself about to explain a choice no one asked me to explain. The guilt he trained into me is still there, still automatic, still reflexive. I'm working on it, working on recognizing when it's real versus when it's trained, working on having needs without shame, working on existing without apology, working on believing that my feelings and needs and choices are valid, even if they cause someone else temporary discomfort. It's harder than it should be. The training runs deep. Here's what I wish someone had told me when I was 2 months in, when the first guilt insertions were happening. When I started feeling responsible for his loneliness. Guilt is not love. Feeling bad about your choices is not the same as those choices being wrong. If someone makes you feel guilty for having boundaries, for having needs, for having a life outside them, that's not consideration, that's control. If you find yourself constantly apologizing, constantly explaining, constantly making yourself smaller, you're not in a relationship, you're in training. The guilt comes before the request because that's how the training works you. Learn to control yourself. You learn to anticipate their needs. You learn to prevent their discomfort by sacrificing your own comfort. You become the enforcement mechanism of your own control. They don't need to tell you what to do because you're already doing it. Trying to prevent the guilt that comes from disappointing them. If you're reading this and you feel guilty constantly, if you apologize for things that aren't wrong, if you find yourself managing someone else's emotions by controlling your own behavior, if you feel anxious before making any choice that prioritizes your needs, you're not being considerate, you're being controlled. The guilt is the weapon. The silence is the enforcement. The sighs and the mood shifts and the loaded words are the training mechanism. Guilt-based control is almost impossible to prove, almost impossible to explain, because the person using it never has to say anything explicit, never has to make demands, never has to threaten. They just have to create an emotional environment where you feel responsible for their happiness, where your needs feel selfish, where your boundaries feel cruel, where existing in ways that require them to accommodate you feels wrong. You didn't miss the signs, you were trained to ignore them, guilty feeling by guilty feeling. Taught that considering their feelings meant ignoring your own. Taught that being a good partner meant making yourself small. Taught that love requires constant apology for taking up space. The training was so gradual you thought it was normal, thought it was what relationships require, thought you were just learning to be less selfish. My name is Nicole. I'm 30 years old. I spent 3 years in a relationship where I never heard him yell, never heard him make accusations, never heard him demand anything, but I felt guilty every single day. Guilty for existing in ways that weren't entirely about him. Guilty for having needs that required accommodation. Guilty for being a whole person instead of just his partner. And it took me 4 months after leaving to start believing that I deserved to take up space without apologizing. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about how the good times were part of the trap, how the periods of happiness weren't breaks from the control, how the good days were strategically placed to make the bad days survivable, how the cycle worked to keep you hoping, keep you trying, keep you staying. That's when you understand that nothing about the relationship was accidental. The good was as calculated as the bad. The happiness was as strategic as the guilt. It was all designed to keep you exactly where you were.